There is a word hidden in plain sight on the very first page of Scripture, and almost no one talks about it. In Genesis, the very first sentence, the word translated as God is not singular, it is plural. Elohim, not one being presiding over creation, but many, a collective, a council, a presence that the ancient world understood not as metaphor, but as literal celestial reality. One man spent 50 years of his life returning that word, that truth, to the public consciousness. His name was Jordan Maxwell, and what he discovered about the Elohim and the hidden sky religion at the foundation of Western civilization is precisely why I am here with you today. Welcome to This Week in the 12th. I'm Leonard Dozier, and dear ones, this is not a standard episode. There's no guest today. What there is, however, is something I believe may be more intimate, perhaps more necessary. Jordan Maxwell was born Russell Pine in 1940. He took the name Jordan Maxwell, a reference he would later explain, to reflect the great waters of truth. Whether he took such a symbolic name to establish a more distinct professional identity, or he followed the way of the Theosophical movement and Helena Blavatsky's Jordanus Maximus reference. In her work Isis Unveiled, it is clear that even his name was a thesis statement. For over 50 years, Maxwell researched, lectured, and wrote about what he called astrotheology, the idea that the world's great religions are not, at their root, stories about human beings at all. They are stories about the sky, about the sun, about stellar cycles, about celestial beings who the ancient world knew by name as the Elohim. Now, I want to be transparent with you, as I always try to be. I came to Jordan Maxwell through my 4 years in solitude and isolation, through the 12th house, as I like to say, through the same thread that brought me to this channel, to this program, to each of you, the thread of the unseen, the inaccessible, the intuitive. And I want to be equally transparent in saying Jordan Maxwell was a complicated man. His ideas were radical, sometimes divisive, and occasionally, like all of ours, imperfect. I'm not here to canonize him. I'm here to take seriously what he spent a lifetime trying to say. Because, dear ones, some of what he found is too important to leave buried. He passed in 2022. His archive lives on through his estate. And as I sit here preparing this episode, I'm also in the process of reaching out to that estate. Because the conversation Jordan Maxwell started deserves a continuation worthy of his legacy. But the conversation itself, the ideas, the questions, the encoded sky religion hiding in plain sight, those belong to all of us. So, let us go there together. Let us start at the beginning, literally. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. If you're familiar with that sentence in any way, you've almost certainly heard it rendered, in the beginning, God created. But the Hebrew word is Elohim, and in Hebrew, im is a plural suffix, same suffix you find in cherubim, in seraphim, in Nephilim. Elohim is not singular. It never was. Now, mainstream theology has a response to this, and it is essentially, Hebrew sometimes uses a plural of majesty, a pluralis majestatis, the royal we of the divine. Perhaps. Jordan Maxwell pointed to something deeper, something the mainstream response tends not to address, because the Elohim don't just appear once, as you've heard my recent guest Paul Wallace state. They appear throughout the Tanakh, throughout the Pentateuch, in moments that are remarkably difficult to explain away as a grammatical convention. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Us. Our. Who is the us? For Maxwell, the answer was neither theological abstraction nor poetic device. The Elohim were, in his view, what the ancient Sumerian texts call the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the sky, celestial intelligences, the shining ones. And if you've been following this channel, if you were with us for our episode with Paul Wallace a couple of weeks ago, this will not be entirely unfamiliar territory.
Paul, just in reading the Eden conspiracy right now, I think one of the passages that really stands out to me, or I should say several pages, really, it's far more, far more than just a passage, it's several pages, where you talk about really Jesus's, his mission, his ministry, his message in the New Testament, and how it makes so lucid the distinction in the God, or source or monad or that higher supreme being that he recognizes, that absolutely is not recognizable to the disciples, who are fundamentalist Jews who should
Yes.
know this God. And one of the disciples says, show me the Father, Jesus, show me the Father. And I think you so brilliantly illustrate how he should know who the Father is. Um,
Yeah.
Considering the Jews' fundamental belief.
Well, that's right. Jews' fundamental belief, question mark, though, because you're quite right that Jesus, whether he's speaking to his closest followers, the 3, the 12, the 72, or when he's speaking to people who are pitching themselves against him, the Jewish religious leaders, his message is that he's talking about someone none of them know.
Yes.
They don't know the God he's talking about. They don't know the
Right.
Theos, the Pata, the Abba that
Yes.
he is talking about. And in fact, in John's Gospel, chapter 8, he counterplays your father, he says, talking to the Jewish religious leaders, versus my father. If you knew my father, you would love me, he says. So it's clear that he's bringing something profoundly new, which again matches the idea that there isn't a word for the God he's talking about in the Hebrew scriptures. Otherwise, the teachers of the law would have known all about that God.
Absolutely.
Paul approached the Elohim through the lens of the New Testament, through the book of the Giants, through the Gnostic Gospels. Maxwell approached them through astrotheology, the conviction that what we call religion is, at its foundation, the codified memory of the ancient sky. So what exactly is astrotheology? In its simplest form, it is this: the recognition that the world's oldest religions encode astronomical observation, the movement of the sun, the moon, the stars as narrative, the sun, the great light giver, the destroyer of darkness, the thing that dies at the winter solstice and is reborn 3 days later as the days begin to lengthen. This is not an accident of metaphor. Maxwell argued it is the original template. Consider, in virtually every major spiritual tradition, you will find a solar hero, a being of light born of a virgin at the winter solstice, who performs miracles, who is betrayed, who dies, who rises. If you identify as Christian, you know this story intimately. If you identify as Egyptian, you know Horus, born of Isis, betrayed by Set. If you identify as Persian, you know Mithras, born in a cave surrounded by shepherds, worshipped on the day we now call Sunday. Sunday, the sun, the sun's day. Maxwell spent decades cataloging these correspondences, not to undermine faith, but to suggest that underneath faith, beneath the doctrines and the denominational walls, there exists a more ancient knowing, a knowing that looks up at the sky and recognizes in those movements something alive, something intelligent, something that the ancient world called the Elohim. And here is where it becomes personal for those of us who live in the 12th house. The 12th house, as many of you who gather here each week already know, is the house of the hidden, of the unseen, of the things that exist just beneath the surface of the three-dimensional world we are taught to take as the whole of reality. It is the house of karmic inheritance, of what is carried across lifetimes, encoded not in our conscious memory, but in something deeper, in what Vedic astrology might call the samskaras, in what Jung might call the collective unconscious, in what Jordan Maxwell might simply call the sky. If you have strong 12th house placements, if the moon, Saturn, Venus, Jupiter, Rahu, or Ketu rest there in your birth chart, there's a very good chance that this information I'm offering today does not feel entirely new to you. It feels like recognition. We often know what we don't know. We often feel what cannot be labeled. That is the 12th house speaking. And what Maxwell argued is that it has always been speaking through the stars, through the symbols, through the ancient traditions that mainstream history has, in many cases, done its level best to suppress. Dear ones, you were born with an antenna for this. The question Jordan Maxwell spent his life asking is, what exactly is it picking up? We're going to take a brief pause right here. If what you're hearing is resonating, if any of this feels like the kind of conversation that has been missing from your week, I would love for you to make this program one you do not miss. Hitting that subscribe button takes about 2 seconds, and it guarantees the next week's episode finds its way to you. We will be right back. There's more to this picture.
Once you start breaking down the symbols in the Old and the New Testament, you begin to see that Christianity is basically astrology and sun worship. Jesus is a metaphor for the sun. Astrotheology forms the foundation for virtually all religions on the face of the earth. It has to do with the worship of the heavens. The correct understanding should be read in the Hebrew. In the beginning, the gods created the heavens and the earth, not God.
So why now? Why does any of this matter in 2026, in this world, in your life? I want to offer you 3 reasons. The first is historical. The language of the Elohim, plural, celestial, sky-oriented cosmology that Jordan Maxwell spent his life excavating, is not fringe anymore. It is increasingly the territory of serious academic scholars, of archaeologists, of linguists who are quietly, carefully arriving at conclusions not entirely unlike Maxwell's. The Sumerian text that Maxwell drew from, the Enuma Elish, the tablets of Nippur, are not disputed artifacts. They exist. They predate Genesis by centuries, and their language is, to put it mildly, extraordinary. The second reason is personal, and it connects directly to the thread that Paul Wallace introduced in this very program a couple of weeks ago. Paul approached the Elohim as a former archdeacon, a man who had devoted decades to the church and found in his own scripture a story that the church itself seemed unwilling to fully tell. His question was not unlike Maxwell's, who said and asked precisely, who exactly are the Elohim? What did the writers of these ancient texts actually mean when they use that word? That question has a living relevance to those of us who came to astrology, to this program, precisely because conventional answers stopped being enough. Because somewhere in the 12th house of our chart, something kept asking, is there more to this? There is. And the third reason, and perhaps the most intimate, is that Jordan Maxwell himself was in many ways a 12th house figure, a man who spent his life exploring what was hidden, who was, by his own account, surveilled, discredited, and marginalized for asking questions that others preferred stayed buried. He was, in the truest sense, someone who lived from the depths. And what he found in those depths, whatever we make of it, wherever we land on the spectrum of belief, deserves to be heard. Jordan Maxwell's soul took flight in March of 2022. He left behind hundreds of hours of interviews, lectures, and recordings. He left behind a body of work that is, at minimum, one of the most audacious attempts of the 20th century to decode the symbolic architecture of Western civilization. He also left behind questions. Questions about who the Elohim truly were. Questions about what the ancient sky watchers knew that we have lost. Questions about whether the encoded astronomy in our oldest texts is not a poetic convenience, but a memory, a transmission from beings or systems of knowledge that predate recorded history. I do not have all the answers. I do not think Jordan Maxwell did either. But I believe deeply, as someone who has spent the last several years living in the silence that the 12th house demands, that the questions themselves are sacred. Because questions are how the 12th house moves. Not in the noise, not in the certainty, but in the space between what we think we know and what we are about to discover. The estate of Jordan Maxwell holds his archive. My hope is that in the weeks and months to come, we will be able to bring that archive to this program in a way that honors the full depth of what he spent his life building. Until then, the conversation belongs to all of us. Keep looking up, dear ones. In the 12th, and always, the current runs beneath the surface. I do not take your eyes for granted, dear ones. Neither do I take your ears for granted. Thank you for lending them to this program once again. See you right back here next week in the 12th. Till next time, take care of yourselves and each other.